Hey folks, thanks for joining me for this episode of the Embellish Podcast, a podcast focused on product stories, product storytellers, interesting brand ambassadors, and anything else that I happen to come up with. Whether you're a bourbon fan, a geek, a casual observer, or someone just floating through this channel, I hope you find what I have to say interesting. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com. I'll try to get that taken care of. I also generally live stream the recording of these episodes on YouTube on Wednesday nights around 9:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. This is the first time I've done this on Wednesday night in a long time, so hope you have an opportunity to hop over here and see what's going on. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or Twitter with the exact same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's also a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. This week, we are going to be talking about crops. We're going to be opening some bottles that I have sitting around. Picked up quite a few over the past little bit, talking about anything that's going on, and just basically rambling for the next 20, 30, 40 minutes, whatever happens to happen. Over the last couple of weeks, lots of things have happened. Had an opportunity to be a part of a Zoom tasting last Saturday with Key in the Lake. Got to taste 6 or 7 different types of spirits. Hold on. Oh, that spilled everywhere. That was awesome. It smells good, at least. Zoom tasting with Key in the Lake. If you don't follow Key in the Lake, if you don't follow Jake over at Key in the Lake, you're really missing out. Jake is a brand ambassador. I'm not exactly sure what his role is, but he works for Starward, which is an Australian single malt company. But he also has a pretty great whiskey podcast. I think his tagline is the best whiskey podcast without whiskey in the name. He's not wrong, probably, but he does a lot of interesting things. I've had an opportunity to do some tastings with him, so we got an opportunity to taste some Irish whiskey, some Scotch whiskey, some Australian whiskey, some rye from the United States, a couple different rye from the United States, or a rye from the United States and a bourbon from the United States. It was part of the World Whiskey Day. They set up a live stream. We're able to have the opportunity to hand deliver some stuff. It was a super, super fun experience. I only got to sit through a part of it because it just so happened that a portion of it overlapped with my oldest daughter's dance recital, so you'll have that. Things kind of get in the way. The first drink of the night, what we're going after, I've got 6 here. We'll see if we make it through all 6 of them, and if I still make sense at the end of the night. We're going with Company Distilling out of Tennessee. You may or may not have seen these recently. It's a straight bourbon whiskey that is finished in Maplewood. Some pretty big names behind that brand. Picked it up, never opened it. Had an opportunity to open it, just haven't had a chance. I've had tons of other bottles that have kind of taken precedence. But like I said, last weekend, great opportunity to do that, and then followed up directly after that. On Sunday, there was a live tasting with Chill Filtered, another podcast you should follow. There's going to be a series of podcasts that I'm just telling you guys, y'all really need to be paying attention to following. But with their Patreon group, they do a live tasting, live show, live stream, not sure exactly what you want to call it, where you get an opportunity to join them while they live stream, taste some of the whiskey that they're tasting. This week it was, or this quarter it was, I believe, Templeton Rye. It was, pretty good stream, and the stream's still up on YouTube. So if you have some Templeton Rye, you can pour some, hop over and listen to what they got to say. Those Cole and Robbie are 2 really interesting characters, and I've had an opportunity to work with them a number of times. Got a chance to go on their podcast. They live streamed with us around the New Year. Us, like there's somebody else here, it's just me. They live streamed with me, but I say us because both of them joined me. And then we might do something again later on this summer. So I'd really enjoy being with those guys. They have a pretty fun podcast. They're pretty good about tasting. It was a really interesting show. And then I guess it was technically before that. Before that, I had another tasting. It was a series of Jack Daniel's whiskeys that were not rye, with David from the Whiskey Ring podcast. Another one. You absolutely should go listen to that. He's a little too smart for me sometimes. Really, really smart guy. has some wonderful content, but we tasted through everything from Jack Daniel's number 7 all the way up to Coy Hill. There were some single barrels in there. There was a Jack Daniel's 10. And one of the real fun things, and I'm waiting on this to sort of marinate and create, the Coy Hill that he was able to share with us, we all got hand-delivered our particular samples, was in the same warehouse location as the Jack Daniel's 10 that we had. And it's actually a 9-year version of it. It's just a significantly higher proof. And so I actually took that Coy Hill sample and, as best I could, with non-scientific instruments, proofed it down to be at the same proof as the Jack Daniel's 10. I'm going to let it sit with that water for a few days, and then we'll give it a try and see if there's any similarities. Of course, I don't have a super well-trained palate. I'm not that guy. But we'll see what it has to do. We'll see what kind of comes out of it or whatever. But this company distilling whiskey is obviously going to be sourced out of Ohio. So that you can kind of guess as to what you think those are. It's pretty good. This is one of those bottles that maybe it's not going to be the first thing that you're going to pick up off the shelf. Maybe not going to be the first thing that you're going to get like super, super excited about. But it's a new offering from a new brand with some new concepts. They're doing some maple finishing. And so the first and the second one that I'll run through tonight are both going to be maple finished, which allows it to still be a bourbon, even though some folks have concerns over the pre-filtration, whatever it is. It's got a little bit of spice to it. I don't know what the mash bill on is. I didn't look. I don't have any research on any of these aside from what's actually on the bottle. But that's what you can sort of expect from what I've got going on here. It's a little fruity, little spicy. Definitely sweet for sure. I said I'll be interested to see what this one does over time, but it's pretty good whiskey. So going back to David, over at Whiskey Ring, he actually there's a little bit of nuttiness to that maybe. I don't know. A lot more spice. He just streamed an episode he just released an episode with Alan Bishop. And if you don't know who Alan Bishop is, you obviously haven't been here for very long. Alan was actually the first... I think he was the first interview that I actually did. Maybe he was the second interview. Let's see if I can be really loud. Alan's a super interesting character. Definitely the kind of person that you would want making your whiskey, I think, or at least in my opinion. I told him, we've always had this kind of running joke at work. What would you do if you won Powerball? And in our episode, I told him, or in the conversation that he and I had, I told him I've always told people, aside from like buying a house, frivolous spending, I would take as much money as I needed to, and I would start a brand, and I would hire Alan to do my distilling, and I would hire Nancy Fraley to help out with the blending and flavor profiles, and I would run that until all of the money was gone or until we were all rich, one or the other. I think it'd be a super fun, exciting experience. All that to say, David just did an interview with Alan Bishop, and I am 90% of the way through it, and it is absolutely fantastic. It's talking about his Whiskey Witch, which is a single barrel offering that Alan has, with a unique flavor profile, a unique mash bill, a unique ethos for creation, a whole bunch of stuff. And David, being the smart guy that he is, he's able to ask really interesting and very specific questions and kind of maybe speak some of that distiller speak. I absolutely am not the person that can do that, but it's obviously fun to listen to. It's like it is similar to listening to one of the Distillers Talk episodes that Alan and Christy and whoever else he happens to have on. There was an episode specifically with Pat Heist that was fantastic. But those were some. It's a great episode, great opportunity for you to go out and listen to that and see what's going on. So we got our first taste out of the way. We'll continue in this finish with toasted sugar maple wood. This one's coming from Tennessee, sort of, as well. if you've been around whiskey for very long, you've seen the Sweetens Cove, their first and second batches, priced a little bit out of my range for at least an entry into the marketplace. You know, it was pretty significant without an age statement to back it up. But they just released the Tennessee offering, which is what this is. We're gonna do a Tennessee offering, which is a lower price point. It's got some good proof to it. I've seen a lot of positive reviews on it. Once again, we're probably not the podcast to be doing reviews or anything of the sort, but we're going to at least give this an opportunity to taste because I was really excited about what Marion Eves was doing with that particular group. And I've said it before, there's a number of celebrities that are involved in the Sweetens Cove project. And if I had to pick one of them that would be sort of my moonshot interview, it might not be what you would expect. One of the musical artists named Drew Holcomb is a part of this particular brand, or at least was for the first handful of bottles. And that's a musician that my family thoroughly enjoys. It was the first real in-person concert that both of my daughters ever went to. It was at the Rye, and it was a fantastic show. So that's sort of my moonshot. You know, Peyton Manning's involved in it, Andy Roddick's involved in it. Love to talk to Andy Roddick. Love to talk to Peyton Manning. But realistically, I would much more prefer to talk to Drew Holcomb about it, or even Marion Eves. But that one's sort of outside the scope of what I think is possible for myself. So that's Sweetens Cove. But what is still going on here this weekend? This weekend is super exciting. This weekend is This Is My Bourbon weekend. So Perry and Eric have put together a meetup weekend in Lexington where they're going to release the New Riff bottle, and a host of other things are going to happen. There's going to be some super interesting characters are going to be involved. But what I'm excited about is that I was able to actually go and be a part of the selection group for this bottle of New Riff. First single barrel selection I've ever done, and told them from the beginning, and I've said it here before and maybe repeat myself, but yeah, it is what it is. I was going to be of very minimal help to them in selecting anything, because I'm just there to enjoy the experience. Don't have a great palate. I enjoy what I enjoy. I don't enjoy what I don't enjoy. And the barrel that I really wanted to pick was the first one everybody wanted to eliminate. It was the most off profile that there was. But that's the kind of thing that I'm sort of into. You can definitely tell that is toasted to a degree. I did say that, right? Yeah, finished with toasted sugar maple wood. I think that I've read somewhere that they use spirals in this. So like a toasted wood spiral that they've dropped down inside whiskey to help finish it out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Not specifically what they're doing, but about what someone else is doing and discussing. Another brand that I happened to come across through social media. But anyways, I'm going to get a chance to go up and spend some time with the guys from This Is My Bourbon podcast. I think the folks from whiskeychannel.com might be there. Jason from Mash and Drum. And if you're watching this, if you happen to show up to this live, which I don't think anybody has, so that's fine. Sort of what I expect. But if you happen to show up to this, I think that Jason from Mash and Drum is live streaming right now. You're probably better off going over there and watching what he's got to say. This will be perfectly fine for you to watch 3 minutes of later on. It's pretty warm. What is it? 100 and something proof? 110 proof? Okay. It drinks 110 proof to me. There's a lot of notes that exist out there, but it's definitely a toasted bourbon. A little bit of spiciness to it, a little bit of proofiness to it. It is pretty full. It doesn't have a really long finish on it. I'll leave it up to you whether you think it's worth it or not. Packaging on it is great. The flavors on it connect to a lot of things that I am interested in. Maybe just a little bit more spicy than I would want. And it's not really even it's not like a black pepper or white pepper spice. It's some other type of spice that's in there. But what hangs out? afterwards is pretty good. It's pretty good. So, like I said, super excited about that. And then I think I'm going to get a chance to go do a distillery tour with another podcast friend. We'll see if that works out. We'll talk about that maybe next week on a live stream. And then I've got a series of other interviews that are coming up in the very, very near future. I've in the past I've sort of kept those things, I don't want to say under wraps. I'm not trying to keep a secret, but it's been more of a, I want to make sure they happen or they're going to happen before I talk about them. But I'm excited. I'm excited about some of the things that are happening. So what I've lined up on the next round of episodes that are coming, I've got hopefully going to have some folks from Scotch Malt Whiskey Society of America join me. I want to talk through kind of what they're doing. I don't know a ton of things about Scotch, and going to buy Scotch is like for a bourbon fanatic is a lot like a Scotch fanatic going to buy bourbon in the United States. There are a ton of labels. There are a ton of different things that you have to consider whenever you're going in to buy. At least with bourbon, you have a generically common flavor profile, but then you have is it a rye? Is it a rye bourbon? Is it a wheated bourbon? Is it a 4-grain bourbon? Is it a finished bourbon? Like, there's a lot of things that kind of go into play. In Scotch, it's a very similar vein, but it is a far less familiar palate for me. And so I think what Scotch Malt Whiskey Society specifically does is really interesting. So I want to talk to them. I asked them if they would be willing to join me so we can talk through some of the things that they've been working on, kind of why they are created. Then before that, I should have an episode with an author. Her name is Shelley Sakier. Sakier, I think is how you pronounce that. She's writing a book that she's getting ready to release. It's called Make It a Double, and it is it's a woman's perspective on discovering whiskey and having a lifelong passion for discovering whiskey. And I think I want to make more space for things like that in our marketplace, whatever you want to call it, because we've talked to a couple of different folks around women in whiskey, and sometimes representation isn't the greatest. Sometimes it's a little lacking. So I'm going to talk to her. And then after that, I've got an episode lined up with the guys over at Penelope. We were supposed to do that a couple weeks ago. And, stuff just sort of came up. I had a last-minute work trip or I had to go to Chicago. And I reached out to them. I was like, hey, is there any way we can postpone? And we're actually going to work on something I think that's going to be pretty interesting. So Matt, Mike, and Danny are really kind of helping me out. I'm going to hop on. We're going to have a discussion. I was able to, I've known Matt for a little while through social media. And then Mike and Danny, I met them at Whiskey Week in Batch 4. And didn't, spend any like one-on-one time to them. Like they probably still don't know me from a stranger, but I did get a chance to talk to them, ask some questions, kind of understand more about the creation of their brand, and try to inform what we're going to talk about with them. So that's sort of the plan there. And then after that, Jake from Key in the Lake / Starward, I'll have him come on. I have a few things I want to talk to him about, and he's agreed to. We do not have a date set. The other three I have dates set for. I don't have a date set for him, and then I've got a couple other people that I'm just trying to do some initial planning, but I did get a pretty solid confirmation that he would be willing to join me. We've moved on to the next one. So, we went through Sweetens Cove and Company Distilling, both Tennessee-ish whiskeys. Tennessee brands, maybe, whatever you want to call it. Now we're moving into more common ground for me. So Maker's Mark has their whiskey drop, which is their sort of fan club. I guess maybe it's an elevated fan club. It's a more exclusive fan club because you've got the ambassadors, but then the whiskey drop are people who sign up for a subscription service, and 4 times a year they get a couple of bottles. Sometimes it's a unique thing. Sometimes it's some things that are more widely available. Things like the FAE 01 and 02, the SP, I can't remember what they were, but the license plate series as they've been dubbed. and then some other single barrels. Well, this time around, this I think is actually pretty interesting to me. They sent out I don't know if it's necessarily a competition, but they sent out 2 bottles that are sort of linked to each other. And they're single barrels that were selected by 2 different employee types. And let me see if I can peel this off on stream without making a terrible mess. This red wax can be problematic. It is a fantastic marketing tool, distinct. I love the way it looks, but it can be a bear. It's not quite as bad as some other brands' wax. I'm not calling any names of Jim Beam products that use it. But what they put out, which is interesting, and if you're not a part of the whiskey drop, and you can be, maybe you should be, is they put out a single barrel. One is a master distiller selection, and the other is a master of maturation selection. And so basically we have the ability to compare, does the master distiller meet my flavor profile, or does the master of maturation meet my flavor profile? They both have very distinct and unique jobs within that particular brand to put things out. It's a great opportunity to try things, and I think there's going to be some really interesting other bottles that are going to come available in the next whiskey drop, so what they're doing later on. But getting back to talking about things out there, so those are the upcoming episodes I have. We're almost 30 minutes in, and I have yet to mention anything beyond what's going on in my life. So early this week, I can't remember, I came across a particular upcoming brand that is utilizing TikTok pretty heavily. I still don't understand the value of TikTok for a whiskey brand or for even myself. Maybe it's a generational problem. Maybe us Gen Xers just don't get it. In the same way that our parents looked at the internet like it was a ridiculous thing, we may be looking at TikTok like it's a ridiculous thing. I just tend to think that TikTok actually is a ridiculous thing. Anyways, so they hit all these buzzwords. They hit all these fantastic buzzwords of veteran-owned, organic crops, sustainable production, waste reduction, rapid aging. They have all of these things that they're sort of connecting on. And is it marketing gimmickry, or is it legitimate things? And so they've latched on to something that I talked about in the past, of this potential shortage of barrels and or wood in the future, and the fact that the art of making a barrel is an incredibly wasteful process because you only get 1 to 2 barrels per tree, and the way that bourbon has to be aged, the fact that it has to be an entire barrel, they're looking for aging at the bottle level potentially by adding in wooden spires, which someone in the marketplace is already doing something very, very similar to that. But they're hitting all these buzzwords that are going to be really, really attractive to folks that have specific mentalities around sustainability, around crops, around a host of other things. But you have to be sort of cautious about that. And I've got a little bit of experience around the concept of farming, so that's why I wanted to talk about crops tonight. And it also makes sense to talk about crops considering we're in the midst of prime corn planting season, and we're coming out of harvest season for things like wheat, things like rye, things that are the overwinter crops that people are putting in their fields, whether they're cover crops or whatever else happens to be. But this focus on organic crops makes it feel like you're getting something safer, something more valuable, non-GMO. There's a bunch of buzzwords that exist, and one of the things that you have to be cautious about is that organic doesn't necessarily mean that it is chemical free. It just means that they only use chemicals that still allow it to be organic. And so there's a very distinct list of things that they can put on crops. And this particular brand hinged on the fact that if someone sprayed some type of a chemical on the ground, then it's going to stay with that corn through harvest, through milling, through mash, through distillation, and end up in the barrel, and then subsequently in the bottle. And how that is, kind of sort of negative to you. But then in the same advertisement, they're using this concept of, it is more important that, whenever they use these spires for aging the whiskey, the whiskey absorbs all the toxins, and then they pull it out of the barrel, they hang it up, and they let it dry out, and those toxins then dry out. And so I was sort of curious, like, how is it that the toxins that are absorbed into the chemical or into the charcoal spire that they're using just dissipate with air based off of this spire, as opposed to dissipating in the air on the corn while it's in the field, or being left behind during the distillation process, or any host of other times where that particular chemical could drop off. So it just felt like a lot of gimmickry. I'm not going to name a name. I'm not going to get into that because you'll either ever see them or you won't. They may be a thing. But let's talk about crops. That's a problem right there. That is a problem, because I think I know which one I prefer. And the one that I prefer, I don't know, maybe it makes more sense. I have to go back and forth a little bit on that one. So let's talk about crops. Let's get into this. We're 30 minutes in. It's time to talk about this. Maybe I can burn through this in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. There's not a ton of necessarily new information for anybody out there that has been following bourbon, whiskey, anything along that lines. But so in the United States, largely corn and wheat are considered what would be cash crops because of pricing, because of consumption, because of international markets, a whole host of reasons. Those are going to be primary cash crops. And they're grown in alternating seasons. Corn is usually a summertime crop, and wheat is an overwinter crop. There'll be a lot of wheats that are put in specifically in the South, specifically in Kentucky, during the winter months. It allows for a number of different things to happen. Weed control happens because you're putting something specific there, and so it's drowning out weeds. It's potentially adding nitrogen back into the soil, a whole different list of things that are happening. Rye is also considered a cover crop, but it is used significantly less in the state of Kentucky because, number one, it doesn't grow super well here, and number two, like rye is okay with less than stellar soil, right? It doesn't have to have. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. What it was that Ari told me about rye, but rye is just a hardy grain. It sort of lives on its own. As a result, it does well in poor soil, but it also is not a significant cash crop in the United States, and so it's largely used as a cover crop. It's not something that people focus on for profitability. And then if you take it a step further, barley is a significant afterthought in North America. And so when you look at the four main grains that are a part of the bourbon industry, only two of them are considered cash crops that are going to make a farmer profitable, and the other two are secondary crops, things that you might grow for fun or whatever. Yep, it's pretty straightforward for me. We'll go back to another taster in a second, and then we'll know for sure. But in Kentucky, we consider bourbon to be our native spirit, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again here. Our native spirit technically is going to be rye, because it's going to be one of the first whiskeys that were made in North America, and whenever there was significant quantities of rye being made, it was being made in this area. We technically weren't even a state yet. We were still a part of Virginia, but rye was the primary source of whiskey creation. Now, it's whiskey creation in the sense that this is going to be largely white dog. There wasn't a ton of, charred barrel aging. That wasn't significantly a thing, and a lot of colonial whiskey is going to be a white whiskey, just based off of how it was done. But the Civil War helped to spread what would be considered sweeter whiskeys from the South to the rye drinkers who actually prevailed in the war. And so this corn, right? And so corn being a crop that is not necessarily native to the United States specifically, where rye sort of is, wheat sort of is, but like understanding the cultivation of these things is slightly different. It doesn't really matter. The Civil War helped spread the interest in bourbon, and then the interest in corn-based whiskeys, sweeter whiskeys, and then as Kentucky becomes a state. Well, Kentucky became a state before the Civil War, but as bourbon became a thing as people started kind of investing into it. Corn whiskey sort of took off because the state of Kentucky specifically has really good soil for growing corn. It's one of our most significant cash crops in the state. And I think I read somewhere where we have the ability to produce all the corn that is needed to create all of the whiskey that we want to create in the state, which is a pretty significant feat. But barley, so we'll backtrack a little bit to the less interesting, less common crop of barley. Without a doubt, the Master of Maturation Selection bottle is my favorite, and that may be one of the better bourbons that I've had in the last little bit. There's a really, like a very deep, dark flavor to it, which I guess would make sense if it's the Master of Maturation. She's really just focusing on making sure that it is aged well and aged appropriately. Anyways, backing back up. So barley is largely produced commercially for livestock feed. It's something that decreased in or declined in production growth, whatever you want to call it, because of the profitability of corn, soybeans, and wheat specifically. Very, very specifically, right? So corn and soybeans are sort of king in the state that for summertime crops, and then wheat is going to be king for fall and winter type crops. Barley usually is a lower priced product than wheat, has a lower degree of profitability as far as the crop is concerned, and the quantity of barley demanded has been low over time, right? There's been other means of feed, other means of consumption, but more recently, demand for it has increased slightly, very, 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 very slightly. Part of it is an increase in interest in whole grain foods for breakfast cereals, a host of other things. As we want to get more healthy and understand our connection to our food, we want less processing, so that means we want whole foods, and barley can kind of meet that. And then there's an increase in interest because the swine and poultry industries are looking for cheaper grains to feed. If we think, corn and soy are higher value, higher priced commodities, and you're wanting to be able to grow your chickens or your pigs as fast as you can, as cheap as you can, to be able to get the most amount of money per pound, you want something cheaper. How do you feed them cheaper and still maintain some degree of quality? So there's an increase in the demand. But the problem is that the demand increase has not also led to an increase in the price of barley. It hasn't been a linear handheld pattern. It is corn and soybean and wheat still reign supreme price-wise, and barley does not. And so there's an increase in demand, but not an increase in price. And so as a farmer, you're not going to want to make that choice to go ahead and grow barley. Beyond that, technology advances. Different varieties are created, and we find ways to take the same acres and create more barley for it. And so that's the sort of the second facet to it, is that I can get more barley off of the same acres, but I'm still not getting a ton more money for it. And so there's not been an increase in acres farmed. There may be an increase in output, but not an increase in acres that are farmed. And so barley, for whiskey concerns, is not grown on a great scale in the state of Kentucky. And, it's one of the essential ingredients, one of the primary things that we need specifically for the malted barley, for the enzymatic conversion, or whatever you want to call it. Not a ton of it being done here, right? So if we're talking about crops, we're talking about the four main crops. It's not something that you can consider largely for the state. If you do a quick Google, you'll find a handful of malting houses and people that are growing barley with the intent of selling to distillers. It's not a significant quantity. Hey, Zachary Jones. Right now we're drinking random whiskeys and talking about crops. If you've got anything you want me to bring up, let me know. We went through Company Distilling. We went through Sweetens Cove. We went through Sorry, Sweetens Cove, Tennessee. Let's be specific. It's not the expensive one. It's the cheap one because I'm too poor for the other ones. And then Maker's Mark's Whiskey Drop series, where they just did with the Master Distiller selection and the Master of Maturation selection. I'm kind of comparing the two. And thank you for saying, hey, beautiful. I think that it is probably time for you to talk to your optometrist, if that's where you're landing, as far as your thoughts, that this is beautiful. But hey, I appreciate it. I almost thought about a crop top, but I'm very concerned that my wife would come up here and think that I've already started that OnlyFans page that she's been on me to start for a long time, and I've been hiding the money from her. So that kind of runs the gambit of barley. Barley is less than a significant crop in the United States, or in Kentucky specifically. But wheat on the other hand, is absolutely not. So within the state of Kentucky, we're looking at, 30 plus million bushels of winter wheat that was harvested on, probably a tenth of the acre. So, or maybe 100th. I don't know. I can't do math tonight. It's not that night. Wheat is, a non-native crop. It was brought here by colonists, and it sort of sees this weird growth patterns as people in the country became, there's a ton of wheat that was being grown and sold in the United States to be able to make bread, make a host of other things, flour, whatever you want. But then you hit this sort of craze that is created that, we can't eat that because of gluten. Gluten's going to kill us all. It's going to be the worst thing that's ever happened. What we see is a slump in wheat production, right? And so if we're looking for mass quantities of wheat to exist, to be able to make wheated whiskeys, we start competing with the bread companies. It's still considered a pretty significant cash crop in this state. It is something that people can make a living. It's sort of an off-season crop for them. They're able to put it in, overwinter it, pull it back out, make some money off of it. So if you're looking at a distillery who says, we source all of our grain locally, if they're talking about the corn or the wheat, they likely are. If they're talking about rye or malted barley, they are likely lying, unless they're doing it at a very, very, very small level. And one of the interesting things, so this is what I kind of came in as we kind of transitioned to thinking about rye specifically, is when human beings domesticate wild plants, right? So they take, everything came from a wild plant. Corn at one point in time looked more like grass than it does like corn now. And so whoever's watching right now, you're going to be super bored. It just is what it is. But when we domesticate these plants, we change the characteristics. And if we go back and anthropologically look at it, we're able to see whenever it went from a wild plant to a domesticated plant, because we're starting to selectively breed it. We're starting to try to get specific characteristics out of it. But rye is one of those crops that we can't directly point to when it became domesticated, because rye started as a wild plant, but then it became a weed that was a byproduct of growing wheat, right? As we were kind of we were domesticating wheat, rye was growing interspersed in there. And so it became a weed to us. Instead of just a wild plant, it became a weed. And then at some point in time, we started consuming it as just a byproduct of consuming wheat and barley. And eventually becomes domesticated. But so we can't point to 18 or 1422 is whenever rye got domesticated, or 1200 or whatever the time frame is, because it made this weird transition. But rye specifically in the state of Kentucky is it's a cover crop, plain and simple. It's intended to suppress weeds and reduce soil erosion, and it does have the intent of capturing nitrogen and putting it back into the soil, adding in, organic matter, a ton of other things. But it doesn't grow super, super well in this particular state. It's I guess it grows just fine, but it's just not super, super profitable. What is interesting to think about, I think, what I find interesting isn't always interesting, but what is interesting to think about is that if we look at the historical farmer and how we're creating bourbon now, specifically, we'll just talk about bourbon specifically, is corn is the primary ingredient. Corn, 51% corn, always. Corn is a summertime crop. The secondary grains in these, malted barley being the thing that we use for the enzymatic reaction. But if we think about rye or we think about wheat, those are what would be fall/winter crops. So those would be things that would be put in after corn. And so what we're ending up with in the bottle whenever we look at these things is a crop cycle. We're looking at a growing season. We're looking at a farmer's year-to-year profitability. And so for the historical farmer, if you were looking at it, they would probably have a corn whiskey and have a rye or wheat whiskey because they're trying to convert their dried grain into something that is storable, right? And so if they wanted a whiskey that it was, part corn, part rye, it would probably be blending after the distillation process actually happened. Have absolutely no historical evidence to prove that or to even think about that, or did we even have blended whiskeys, or was it just like whatever it was we had available is what we actually took care of? And it might be more likely that you could create a mash out of leftover corn and rye or wheat. If you take the summer and you harvest the corn and then you let it sit through the winter and then you use the next year's rye or wheat crop to create the whiskey, that might work because that corn would overwinter just fine. But neither here nor there. Most of the rye that we use for bourbon is grown in Europe, right? And that's just sort of a common piece of knowledge. And if you think about it from a sustainability stake or just from a sheer cost perspective, bringing rye from Europe here is not inexpensive. And so, what do you do about that? Places like Woodford Reserve have taken initiatives to try to reintroduce growing rye as a cash crop in the state with the interest of bringing the crop back here. And so if we go back to, I think it's in the 2020, roughly, they picked up 26 farmers, began farming rye again. Something around 1,500 acres. The interest was for them to grow that 1,500 acres to 10,000 acres. So, tenfold growth approximately. So they can not only, add an additional crop into the Kentucky farmers' Rolodex of profitability, but they can decrease their overall cost in being able to pick up and maybe even have higher quality grain because they have, kind of more control over what the output actually is. So now that I've gone through the Maker's Mark, we're moving to the last one here. And this is, I don't know, maybe this is fitting, I guess. We have the Jack Daniel's Triple Mash, right? So Jack Daniel's just put these out. They're everywhere, reasonably priced. It's bottled and bond. It's a blend of American malt, rye, and Tennessee whiskey. And so there's going to be corn. There's going to be malt. There's going to be barley. There's going to be rye. Or maybe even some wheat mixed in somewhere for good measure. And it's all bonded whiskey. So it's bottled and bond, 100 proof. My assumption is they have all three of those were bonded whiskeys that they blended together. Or maybe they mashed it of all three. No, I think it's got to be that way. I don't need to see if this is important. All right. So rye. So rye specifically is an interesting thing in the United States, right? So its popularity, at least in the coastal states and the colonies, came out of a lack of molasses from the Caribbean countries for rum distillation. Rum was huge in colonial America. Maybe it was out of proximity to the Caribbean. Maybe it was because it was a new and unique spirit. largely because of, there's a mustiness to that. Largely because of the English's hostility and their controlling of the Atlantic Ocean, their colonialism, whatever you want to call it. But as the Caribbean molasses started to dry up, the colonists needed to find a way to be able to make their own distillate, and rye, specifically in the New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland area, is going to grow really, really well. And we're seeing a resurgence of Pennsylvania rye. We're seeing Empire rye, which none of these are carrying. I don't think any of them are carrying any TTB restrictions yet. But I believe they're looking for those, or at least state level restrictions. Same thing with Virginia and Maryland. You can still go to Virginia, go to the I think Mount Vernon, and get a replica of George Washington's whiskey that he was making, which is going to largely be a rye whiskey, because that was what was super, super popular in that particular area at that particular time. I don't know what to think of this. You can definitely taste the malt in that. Malty, malt. So, sort of finishing this rye thought process. Rye is one of those spirits, or at least here recently, that is starting to gain a little bit of its resurgence. I've heard distillers and brands talk about the inability to get rid of rye a handful of years ago because we were in the middle of the bourbon boom, and nobody really cared about rye. But as it becomes harder to pick up specific bourbons, specific things you're trying to try, the marketplace gets a little crowded and confusing or whatever. Rye is gaining popularity. And so to kind of polish this all off, we're going to hit the High West Rendezvous Rye. They have their own, I don't remember what it's called, Pioneer Series, something. I don't know. They've got their own little club that they're putting out where you can kind of subscribe, and they'll send you some special bottles or whatever. Mine just came in, and I've had their bourbon. I've had a single barrel of their bourbon. I've had their double rye, which the double rye that I had I didn't particularly care for. It just had a unique flavor profile that I wasn't necessarily interested in. But this is the first Rendezvous Rye that I've had from them, and it's a rye. So rye is gaining traction, gaining popularity in the United States. It's is the Rendezvous worth a buy, or is the triple mash worth a buy? Which one are you asking, Zach? I'm gonna pause for a minute and let you answer that, because hey, you're here and you're interacting, and I absolutely want to answer you. I would say the Jack Daniel's triple mash for sure is worth a buy, because it's not super expensive as long as somebody's got it jacked up on prices. If it's at MSRP, no reason you shouldn't pick it up. Rendezvous Rye, I don't know. I'm gonna have to sit on this one. I may have to try it a couple different times, because I'm a little bit finicky on the ryes that I do like. The triple mash, yes, absolutely buy the triple mash. $35. That's a quality whiskey. It's got some unique flavor to it. You can definitely taste the maltiness, the fruitiness, the dustiness almost. It's 100 proof. I mean, where else do you find a $35 100 proof whiskey that's blended from Jack Daniel's like this? I don't know. I think it's definitely worth it. So anyways, rye's picking up a resurgence. The crop is picking up some traction in the United States. When we talked to Ari, he's working on a project to try to get Rosen Rye kind of reinstituted in the state. I've heard some interest from some folks in New York wanting to have their own rye variety there. It's all interesting stuff. So all that to say, we've tasted through 6 things. We've talked for roughly an hour, maybe 10 minutes worth of good content in here. So if you're still hanging out, I appreciate it. That's all I got. So thanks for tuning in for this offering from the Embellish Podcast. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform you have to be consuming this on, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can be found at embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, and contact details. I'll be back again next week with another new offering for you. So until then, cheers and thanks for hanging out.
Bye.